that's one of the hardest things for me to do, to step out behind the curtains and say, yeah, I might have built the highest scoring LEED Platinum building in the world, but what were the impacts of that really?
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand. And today on the show, we've got Zach. Zach, how you going?
I'm great, here in Seattle on the Salish Sea.
And we're joined today by Ilka. How are you?
Good. Very well.
Very good. All right. Well, we're going to, I guess in your words, Zach, we're going off the beaten path a little bit today with a nice little interview that Ilka did, which we'll get her to tell us a little bit about. But before we do that, let's have a quick shout out to our supporters.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything we do at the Passive House Accelerator, including Passive House Podcast, comes thanks to support from our sponsors. So a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Also, thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Glavel, Ingui Architecture, Minutair, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And thank you to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, Proseco, and Source 2050.
Awesome. All right. So, Ilka, you shared with us a very interesting interview that you did after a presentation that was obviously impactful. Tell us a little bit about what that presentation was and how you happened to be there.
Yeah, so it was impactful because I went to this conference. It was the New York State Green Building Conference in Syracuse. And I just happened to be there because I was presenting. I had never been there before. And it's a very local, small conference, but it was amazing. And I just happened to walk into this one session. I wasn't planning on doing any interviews at this conference at all. I didn't even bring my equipment. But I happened to walk into this session, and it was called Activating the Inner Development Goals to Accelerate System Change. And I had really no idea what to expect. And then, it turned into this experience basically where there's this exercise in the beginning where you were really being put into this into this mindset of the 7 generations, and you found yourself as being a bridge between the past and the future. And there was this little bit of a communication piece with other attendees, and people were crying. It was very, very impactful in a way. And then that kind of set the stage for really just thinking about these inner development goals. And the idea is really, how do we close? They talk a lot, and Melissa and Kevin are going to talk about this quite a bit, but they talk about closing the knowing doing gap, because we do have all this knowledge and these solutions and the tech to really battle climate change, but everyone feels like we're not really getting there, at least not as fast as we should. So working on your inner development goals from their perspective is a way to think about it in a different way, and maybe being able to change things on a personal level and then affect the system in a way.
And this references back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm assuming that a lot of our audience will be familiar with, but there are 17 of them, covering a whole range of aspects, everything from poverty, affordable and clean energy, decent work, but also a lot of things that are very directly related to things that Passive House can do, like sustainable cities and communities, and climate action as well. So it's really, this is really interesting to cross over between that work of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also this was what was the conference name? It was the Green Building Conference, yeah?
Where I went, that was the New York State Green Building Conference, yes.
Right. And so I really like anything that joins up those different flavors of doing what a lot of us are involved in slightly different ways. So I think there's lots to talk about here. So let's get into it. We'll listen to your interview, your catch up after the session, and then we'll share some thoughts afterwards. So enjoy this interview.
This is Ilka Cassidy with the Passive House Accelerator podcast, and I'm actually in Syracuse today at the New York State Green Building Conference, and I just saw a really, really interesting presentation. You could call it that. Or session. I am very inspired to get the word out, to make this my action item for today, to let our listeners know about what you talked about. And what was very inspiring or interesting was that it's an idea, or it's an approach that maybe not necessarily directly related to green buildings, but you're saying it's actually very important to think a certain way, and that might be the way to turn things around. Yes. Could you introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about the session that you presented today?
Sure. So I'm Melissa.omara, and I grew up on a farm. I went to engineering school. I ended up in the IT application development space and eventually in the green building space. And I was very inspired by An Inconvenient Truth in 2006. And from that time on, really became a bit of a troublemaker inside of my organizations and an internal change maker. And in 2014, started my own company. The session today was about, because we will continue. Well, we had a call to action. We didn't know would end up in a podcast episode, but it's about accelerating transformation in the built environment through the inner development goals. So I'm going to let Kevin, my co-presenter and my partner, to introduce himself.
So I'm Kevin Stack. I grew up being educated as a biologist. Did a training in biomimicry with Janine Benyus, but I've been a builder for over 4 decades now. And so I guess I'm somewhat referred to as a biologist who became a builder, so I look at things differently. And part of our message today for the inner development goals is that we need to get back to first person. We're always being all these requirements for third-party verification, Energy Star checklists, LEED checklists, National Green Buildings checklists, but this really needs to come from within for us to hopefully get to the next step of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
Great. I mean, the whole concept is really interesting, but I think it was also very inspiring or interesting how you started the session. Can you talk about that?
So we were in Stockholm, Sweden in 2022 for the very first Inner Development Goals Summit, where this idea that we need to develop our inner capacity, our consciousness almost, right, to think differently and be differently and interact with each other differently, that was announced out to the world in a pretty big way. I think there were only about 500 or 600 people there, though. Mm-hmm. And we traveled there. In order for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, to be achieved, a a group of thinkers came together who do human development work and said, what do we need to develop in ourselves? So we experienced this session, this conversation with the seventh generation, an exercise which we decided that we wanted to replicate in our own work to really inspire people to think, to execute long-term, like really long-term thinking ahead to the seventh generation, inspired by the Haudenosaunee people's view that every action that they take considers the impact on the seventh generation. And so, yeah, we wanted to recreate that. And there are roots in this. Joanna Macy is the first person I know of to actually do this exercise. And then
Phoebe
Tickell, who is also a consultant, I think, out of the UK. Her company is called Moral Imagination, and she does these kinds of activities and led the initiative at the IDG Summit, which was, again, it had us in tears, had me in tears. And we thought, wow, this moved the hearts and minds. And and it only took 15 minutes, right? I think that was part of the thing that really touched us. Did it move your heart and mind?
It did. You had me in tears too, definitely. What I thought was really interesting about this is that it really just set the tone, right? You experienced emotionally where you need to be in order to just think about things a little bit differently, that it's something that touches us, within us. And I don't know, for a moment, I actually stopped thinking about cost, right? That's always the thing that comes to mind when you try and do something a little different in the building industry, is at the end, it just comes down to cost. So, and that's kind of what you're appealing to, that maybe that shouldn't be the first thing that comes to mind, right? Maybe the priority is just turning inward and rethinking what is important for us as humans, right? Or for the next 7 generations. Yeah. So I thought that was really, really powerful.
As ancestors, like we are the ancestors now of the 7th generation, and what we're doing, these decisions we make, we're co-creating the future that they're going to be living in one way or another.
Yeah.
If hopefully we get that far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's powerful to think about all these generations, and in the beginning you had us think about our previous generations and the future generations and consider us as a bridge. And I feel like if you think that way, you might really kind of turn your project thinking around a little bit. So where do you think this can actually how do you turn this into something that a project team can work with?
Yeah, so I'll start, because our goal here is, one of the last 5 of the IDGs is actions. We want to create an actionable item out of this. That's where we thought of the integrative design process that LEED has championed for the last 30 years. And now they made that, instead of a credit, they made it iterative, so it goes throughout the entire credit system. So what it lacks, though, what we feel it lacks, is the soft side of the Sustainable Development Goals, so the inner development goals. And if we can integrate that into a project through using that process that's already established, I think that's a good starting point. The other creation of local areas, I don't want to use the word hubs either, but there's hubs set up that we can actually reach out and bring this out further. I know Melissa was approached by an ESF student and one of the staff members there to bring it into the college system, where, if we can start with the generation behind us and show them what the generation directly in front of them need to do to achieve this, I think the knowing-doing gap can be bridged in this generation. And it really needs to be bridged right now. We're behind, and we need to make that leap. I mean, today's leap today, so as far as us, as I am concerned, we're catching up to the sun this year. And the minute we catch it, we should do something.
Interesting. Yeah, and so I love that we can potentially do this and capture the imagination of students, I also truly, deeply believe that we can capture the hearts and minds of most of the people. And we talked about this idea of, in New York State, we are lucky to have regulations and laws that say that we have to move forward very quickly, and targets in the building space that are very, really a moonshot. We've got a moonshot here that we're aiming for by 2030, and then another moonshot or set of series of things by 2040, 2050. So we can't wait for the next generation. We also need to bring this to our project teams today, to our and if we're in an organization where there's personal development, professional development, why not really focus in on the inner development? And I think it would be helpful to talk about what these inner development goals are. So, Kevin, you want to talk about the 5? All right. So, I'm going to get one. I'm going to miss one, so you'll help fill it in. So there are 23 skills, but they're like the SDGs, they're categorized into 5 main elements or dimensions. So the first is being. How are we being with each other? What is our, and this aligns really with, are we operating authentically in alignment with our inner compass and our values? And which requires a lot of courage at times, right? Relating. How are we relating to other people? How are we at communicating? How are we at empathy and compassion? Those are just some of the examples in the relating space. Thinking. So it's not all soft. Systems thinking is crucial. And long-term thinking, which is one of the main things that 7th generation exercise enabled, but also sense making. How do we make sense of, and that's one of the reasons we also introduced the integral model with a simple 4 quadrants. How do we make sense of, these IDGs as part of a whole systems transformative change? We need to look at our own inner dimensions individually with the integral model, but also our external skills and behaviors and things you can touch, see, and feel. Certifications, all of the things that, actually the industry's done fairly well to create these, FIAS is a collective or Passive House is a collective external thing. It's a set of standards measures in that lower right quadrant that we can touch, see, and feel that can inform us. But on the inner collective are things like culture and shared purpose and shared values. And you can do that on any project. You can take that extra 15 minutes at a project, at a charrette or a project kickoff meeting, and really, you'd be surprised. I've been surprised at how grown men can cry, right? Who've been in the industry for 30 or 40 years when they think about their own grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So being, relating,
collaborating and acting.
Yeah, thinking, collaborating, and acting. Yeah. And I think people understand the concept of collaborating for sure, and the idea of action. But what's the inner development underneath that? Well, to take action requires a whole lot of courage and humility, and so it's not just driving action, but I also like to talk about the idea of being a change whisperer by meeting people where they're at in a language that they're comfortable with, so they don't feel like it's a should, must, but it's somehow that we find a way to pull them in with their own hearts. So those are the IDGs.
Yeah, that's definitely right along. Like I went to, or we all went to the Passive House conference in Houston this year or last year, and what was interesting, what came out of a lot of the sessions was we all kind of want the same. It just really depends on how you approach people and how you talk about it. So it's all about communication before, people shut down. You just really have to communicate in the right way, because we do kind of want the same thing. And I think your approach is really interesting because you're kind of going way deep into something that's cross-cultural and cross-age and politics and everything. So I feel like if you really kind of go down that deep and appeal to that, maybe the communication is actually going to be a lot easier because it just, crosses those bridges already. Yeah. So, Kevin, you talked about the knowing and doing gap. What do you mean with that?
So it's a phrase from Otto Scharmer, and it's something that he created and explains much more eloquently than I can. But it's the understanding that we know what the problem is. We know we have the solutions, but we just can't get across that divide to do it. So he refers to it as the knowing-doing gap. We know it, but we're not doing it. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act here in New York State that's been passed, and the other law that follows it up that's going to codify it in May 2023 was passed. So that means by January 1st of 2026, New York State's going to be electrified. And by that I mean no fossil fuel infrastructure can be brought into buildings 7 stories or less. And so that's a wicked problem for us to get there and get the industry and the workforce to actually manage and do that. So that gap right now, the strongest thing we see is the workforce. The policy side of it is going to be hard to implement. So they specifically chose the building codes to be the driver of this. So it's the knowing-doing gap is getting closed right now in New York State. But the doing part is the difficult part. It's going to be hard to do, and that's where we feel, I feel, I've been in four decades of the Sustainable Development Goals. Before that, the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment. And so now I'm in the Inner Development Goals because we're not meeting it, and I think this is going to marry the IDGs to the SDGs to get that bridge established.
Great. So what would you like to, what's the next steps and what's your call for action?
Yeah, well, so I sprung this a little bit on Kevin today, but so we offered to run a follow-up session, basically an collaboration and activation session for any participants in our group that wanted to figure out, well, how do I bring the IDGs in some way, shape, and form into either my organization? There was a group right after us who have done incredible work in their architectural firm with affinity groups and making sure people have a way to channel their passion into real activity that makes a difference. So we know there are many ways to roll the IDGs out. There's a lot of open source stuff. But yeah, we want to run some sessions and continue to speak about this at other conferences. So if you would like us to speak at conferences or to your university or to your executive team, where we can run the exercise for sure to get it started and open it up and open the dialogue in your firm or in your affinity group or whatever. And then it's about turning that idea, that excitement that you feel like into an action, like, well, hey, now we're on a podcast all of a sudden that we had no idea we were going to be doing.
Yeah, so I think the part of our actionable item is to create a safe, sacred place where people can easily step out of the climate closet and talk about this with each other in a collaborative manner. I think that's critical. That's one of the hardest things for me to do, to step out behind the curtains and say, yeah, I might have built the highest scoring LEED platinum building in the world, but what were the impacts of that really doing that? And we need to, this is a Jedi moment more than the acronym means for this, for the Inner Development Goals.
Great. I'm really excited to hear and learn even more. And thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Thanks for asking us.
Yeah,
it was lovely. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Ilka. That was I found that really interesting. I usually write down lots of notes when I'm listening to interviews, but I just sat there and listened to this to this whole thing. So I don't have any particular notes. First thing off the top of my head, though, is I was trying to think as I was listening about 7 generations and how long that would be. And I couldn't figure it out. But it's quite a long time. Seven generations worth
couple
of
100 years. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a, if you think back to what the world was like 7 generations ago, it's a very different place to what it is today.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what they're trying to show, right? How long it takes and how there is an effect even 7 generations later, right?
Yeah, massive change. I mean, just completely unrecognizable. I would think 7 generations ago, which is interesting because I was at a conference just yesterday, which was about residential development, and it was the sort of usual developer. There's lots of developers in the room, architects, designers, and there was lots of discussion about the current economic situation and the sort of 3-year cycle of politics, economics, and talking about projects that are coming online right now. And it was all about costs, upfront costs, and rate of return on investment. And I just, at the end of the day, I found myself getting quite frustrated because it was just such short-term thinking. And this really hammered that home this morning when I was listening to this, thinking, oh my gosh, all of that discussion, all of the politicians, all of the policies and the spreadsheets that people are working on to try and convince a bank to lend them money for a project right now, some of that just seems irrelevant in the context of this when you look at a big picture and ask that question, what are my grandkids going to think about this? What am I, or how am I going to explain what I've been up to my grandkids, and how are they going to see me in the future? So that's kind of deep.
We're in an interesting place where, we rightly are emphasizing how important it is for us to act in this decade. This is the critical decade, and messaging around 2030, and almost a kind of a do or die kind of thing. But then there's also just this reality that this is we're in it for the long haul. So I was just at actually the Seattle social that was related to the Reimagine Buildings 24 that we did the night before the conference started. Kate Simonen from the Carbon Leadership Forum spoke, and she was referring to and this was alluded to a little bit in the interview, the learning that we're all doing and the evolution of practice and stuff. Like you can think, oh wow, that. Just think back to some of the buildings that I've been tangentially involved in, and that were considered at the time to be like paragons of sustainability, but were maybe too high in embodied carbon. Right? There's this learning process that goes on that is messy. The process that we're going through right now is messy, and also is a long term. Is she was just emphasizing that this is a long term one, and there are going to be bumps in the road, as we all know. Maybe some big bumps on the road this coming soon. Who knows? Hopefully not. And that we also need to be looking. While it's important for us to be acting in this critical decade, we also need to be looking at the long term and be able to survive just like internally. I think that one of the things I was listening for and didn't explicitly hear in the conversation, but I'm sure is embedded in there, is just resilience. Like, this is coming up in our buildings, like that resiliency is becoming more and more an important thing that we're talking about in terms of like being resilient to climate extremes. But I think that all of us also, or maybe I can just speak for myself. I think that it's really like climate change is scary, and the challenge in front of us for transforming the built environment can feel daunting. And it's really important for me to take care of myself, to balance the outrage with with the optimism, to borrow from Christina Figueres. And so I assume I figure that probably is embedded in the being of the five. How are we being with each other in alignment with our inner compass and our values? But that's a kind of a spiritual practice. Like for me, it's Buddhism. I think for other people, it's different things. But like, how do we have a practice of appreciating what is the beauty and wonder that's here, the things that we can save, and stay the course and not get completely freaked out, because that's not. First of all, personally, I don't think it's warranted necessarily. I mean, that can be something that could be a hot topic for a big argument with somebody, I'm sure, but it's also not productive, and ultimately it's not sustainable. So all of us need to be able to figure out how we can sustain ourselves.
Well, I think I feel like they addressed that a little bit with maybe going into schools or universities with this idea where, as us, our generation, if we can kind of align our goals or, think about our priorities in a way where maybe we don't freak out, but we do think, okay, if we align, if we kind of make this into something that's more collective and we have the power to change the system that way, maybe the next generation won't be as freaked out, because there's a lot of mental health issues going on with young teenagers, right? And I think staying calm and showing that maybe there are solutions and maybe we as humans are not all that bad might be, a good approach.
Ilka, I was going to say, at the end, I talked about the knowledge doing gap. Have you reflected on that at all after listening to this, about what it all means for us on a day-to-day basis? How do we take these concepts and put them into practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think they're talking about code changes, as a huge way to change this gap, and that the code is changing New York. It's changing in Massachusetts. I just went to NASI, and it's all about, the changes, the stretch code, and aligning funding. I went to a session about the IRA, like the tax credits. And I think there is movement in aligning what we know with what we kind of need to do. And code where you actually take that knowledge and make it reality is definitely one way. But I think a big thing, and that's kind of what Melissa kept saying, is that, about these action items, like we need to just, kind of reflect on ourselves and then align and collaborate with more people to make this a bigger movement, bigger, way to then impact the system, to make a system change. So I think that's kind of the idea there.
And Kevin kind of sort of took another step with that, with talking about creating a safe, sacred place to talk about the climate problem and recognize, and that's when he was talking about that LEED Platinum building that maybe wasn't actually climate solution making, even though it felt good at the time or whatever, and just kind of exploring that. I think that collaboration piece and the creating places where we can actually talk with one another about is really important, I think, in our community. Like I think about that with the kind of bridging the PHI and FIAS communities, and being able to have respectful, open conversations about these two different approaches and kind of the different philosophies behind the two. But beyond that, it's also, I think, being able to talk about embodied carbon and passive house, and I just feel like there's, the more that we can recognize the way that these the commonality that we have, that as you were saying, Ilka, we all want the same thing, and crossing the kind of bridging. I think it's easy for us to get carried away with differences and think that we're pitting that it's basically back to the dualistic thinking. It's similar to the whole outrage and optimism thing. Like we can hold these different things together at the same time, and I think I think that could be really powerful for us as a movement if we could spend more time collaborating and thinking about those commonalities and recognizing them and being okay with the fact that there will be, for each of us, the combination of like the solution or the combination of things that we think about when we're doing buildings might be different, but we're moving in the same direction, and should celebrate that and build, I guess, draw kind of energy and strength from each other on that journey, as opposed to like the sense of like kind of sometimes there can be a little bit of a battle that's happening, and I don't think we have time for that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wanting to be right, and
right.
From a methodological point of view, but also thinking back to my experience of being at a conference yesterday, and so much is tied up in the sort of capitalistic nature of having to make a business case and having to sell a project or sell an idea, get it over the line, and make the economics stack up. I've got the slide deck that you shared in front of me, and I think we'll put a link to the website that they've got, which is innerdevelopmentgoals.org. But those 5 categories that they address here, the being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and then acting. And underneath those, there are some really great words in there, starting with things like self-awareness and then moving through sense-making and critical thinking in the thinking category. And then it's about relating is humility, empathy, and compassion. Collaborating is a lot about trust, and then acting with courage, creativity, optimism. Those are really good words. And I feel like over the last 3 or 4 years, some of those words or some of these ideas have been a little bit hijacked. Even things like smart cities and the United Nations, there's a lot of mistrust about some of those things in hopefully a small but a pretty vocal part of the population have kind of got the wrong idea about some of those things. And for me, a missing piece of that puzzle and the wayward thinking of sense making, which has become a bit of a there's a bit of a quagmire in social media circles and sort of pseudo thinking. In my perspective of sense making in the modern world, coming from a place of uber privilege in some instances, I think. But critical thinking is so important, and that's where scientific evidence and, in our case, building science comes into the picture and really, I hope, puts people on the right track to a solution, but not necessarily a single solution. Coming back to what you're talking about, Zach, I think that's where we get stuck and where there's danger in thinking that there's only one way, but we can collaborate and get the best of lots of different ways if we do it with humility and empathy. So yeah, anyway, I don't think there's any. I don't have any sort of wiser words than Kevin had during the presentation, but I just encourage people to go and have a look at their content themselves, and I'd be curious what other people took away from that and what it brings up in them. But I'm just really stuck on that critical thinking piece and the fact that we have the tools and we have the science, the building science, to show a really good path to put a lot of these things into place. I don't know what you guys think.
Well, I guess going back to this idea of there's the I, the we, the it. It's like this kind of 4-part piece between individual, collective, and inner and outer. I think the building science kind of comes with skills and experience and behavior that is on the outer side, right? You kind of have your inner goals, and some of the inner goals is to learn these skills, and then you can make again, going back to making a difference. So you can use that knowledge to then implement into something like a building code or a certification or something like that.
Yeah, right. I think that's a really good way of putting it. So this is more spending time thinking internally and reflecting, and that's, I guess, where the inner comes from, the inner, as opposed to the outer, what might traditionally be seen as the hard skills. And I think he alluded to this being more of the soft skills, which, I've heard that term before. I don't know if it kind of dilutes potentially the importance of some of these aspects by calling them soft, because they might be soft, but they're certainly powerful.
Yeah. And it's all about the alignment between all of those things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Any closing thoughts, Zach?
Just that I think that our community, if I say like the Passive House community, I think has always been really good at thinking. And so I think that it's good for us to and acting. So then the message that there are these other elements that are important for us to bring into our work is a good reminder.
Well, I think Passive House has been very good at collaborating too, but collaborating amongst ourselves in some ways, and that's the continued challenge, is outreach to the wider building industry.
I don't mean to imply that we're bad at the other five thing or the other elements there. I just think that's a natural strength, is the left brain cognitive, like bringing the physics to the problem and figure out the optimal solution, all of that, and we can get into heated arguments about exactly how that should happen and all of that stuff. And so I appreciate that there's this just a reminder to cultivate these other elements of inner development.
Well, and I would like to encourage people when they're at the conferences or even the committees picking out sessions, that there should be sessions like this, right? Mm-hmm. And I would like to encourage people to go to them, because so many times you get caught into, okay, what is really applicable to my project right now? I need to learn how to insulate, masonry buildings or something, which is really important and really awesome. And I like going to those sessions, but I really, really always bring back a lot from these other sessions that just look at different perspectives, right? Because you can implement those in so many ways, and not just building science. I don't mean just, but yeah, building science.
Well, it's obviously the other stuff is really important. It only takes a couple of moments for us to start crying when we consider it. So, yeah.
Well, Elke, I think we thought that was going to be a short session, but obviously brought up a lot.
Sorry, everyone, for our pontificating.
Yeah, well, I encourage people to go and check it out.
You're still listening.
Yeah, well done if you're still with us. Innerdevelopmentgoals.org. That's all one word, innerdevelopmentgoals.org. Check that out. There's some great resources. Love to get people's thoughts and feedback on that. Zach, we got anything that we need to comment on?
Yeah, sure. So this week on Passive House Accelerator Live on Wednesday, March 27th, we're joined by Barry Price of Barry Price Architecture, and he'll be presenting a construction tech edition of the show, Design Meets Construction, Passive Principles for Small Practices. So really, it should be super interesting. And then the big one that we want to let everyone know about is on April 2nd, NYSERDA is doing its Buildings of Excellence Round 4 awards ceremony, and the Passive House Accelerator will be producing the live stream of that. And so we'll include registration link in show notes.
Awesome. All right, Tay. Thanks, Ilka. Thank you very much for taking us down that path. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thanks,
Ilka.
And we'll see you back again next week on the Passive House Podcast.